Today we're going to be talking about all kinds of fun stuff. We are going to be delving into some tools that we can use to improve the layout of our UVs. And we are also going to delve into some concepts of this sewing seams and trying to make those look better. And we are also going to delve into the creation of the AO pass, which is the ambient occlusion pass, dirt pass, or speck pass, which is a element of texturing. So we're going to start to see why we try so hard to make good UV layout. Because ultimately, if you have poor UV layout, your textures don't look good either. And that's why we do all that work to make sure it's looking the best we can make it look. And of course, as I pointed out last class, it is critically important you understand this UV mapping process, because from this class forward, you're going to have to UV map everything that you build with polygons. So UV mapping is part of the job as a modeler. 99.9% of the time, you're going to be UV mapping as the modeler. And there's a couple of students from last section who are like, really? Yes, this is part of the job. You have to do it. So until they make a new material for modeling out of that doesn't require that, then you're good to go. But good luck with that. So we have to learn this process. We have to understand it, because again, moving forward, this is what you're going to have to do. So got to get used to it. Again, luckily, we're getting to it early, and we have a bunch of really fun exercises to help you understand these concepts of UV mapping and how they work. And hopefully it'll give you a good concept of how all these processes come together. And with each class that you take, they're going to continue to hit these things, and eventually it will sink in for you. And then it's not actually so bad. I think it's kind of intimidating at first, but like anything that's totally bizarre that you're trying to learn, that's kind of the way it is. But then as you get more comfortable with it, more used to it, it's not so bad. So if that gives you any comfort at all, it won't be bad. You will be able to figure it out. If I can figure it out, anybody can. So you'll be fine. All right, so let's get into improving UV layout. Now, I have an image here of Markero, the greatest marker ever. And if you look at my UV layout, there's already some problems. What do you guys see in terms of problems with my UV layout? What's wrong? Squares are not the same size. And if you remember, I told you on the same object, squares have to be the same size. This is the same piece and the squares are not the same size. So that's a problem. How did I do that though? How do I have squares not the same size? What must have happened? Because this is kind of like I'm looking at, okay, this is bad, but what's going on? Yeah, go ahead. That's exactly what it is. Instead of this being one UV shell, which it doesn't necessarily have to be, but what this is telling me, because I've got different size squares, instead of this being one UV shell, it's actually 3 UV shells. That's why they're different. And the biggest ticket item is the proportions of these pieces relative to each other is inaccurate. Remember what we were talking about last class? When the squares are the same size, the proportions are right. When the squares are different sizes, the wrong size, that shows up as, okay, they're not the same proportion relative to each other. Does that make sense? Hell, maybe. Okay, well, let's look into this. What's going on and why? So first things first, let's open up this file and we'll start playing. Set your project to your activity file folder. And then the file we're going to open, file open scene, we're going to go to our advanced UV tools activity. Whoop. All right, and then we are, Markero. Woohoo! So again, just looking at this, my texture does not flow smoothly. So I know that those are separate shells. I've got distortion going on there because I'm looking at rectangles, not squares. So there's some distortion going on. And my squares are different sizes. which tells me that my shells are not the correct proportion relative to each other. And I can tell all of that just by looking at the squares. I don't even have to open the UV editor. But let's open the UV editor and confirm that which is being shown to me here. So I go to UV and I choose UV editor. And if I select my marker piece, I see I've got a bunch of shells, different sizes, okay? Now, first I'm going to select this shell. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to go to face mode and just select these faces. And then, oh, that's that shell right there. So I'm going to get my move tool and I'm going to bring it over here just to bring it away from everything else. I'm going to grab this shell, that's this piece right here, and bring it over there. And then I'm going to grab this shell, which is this piece, and I'm also going to, whoop, I didn't grab everybody. Grab that piece and bring it over here. All right. These three shells represent these three parts of that same piece. Now, if this is one piece, right? Better question. When you look at this, do these look like those pieces there at all? Did they look like they would go together? Let's take a look. Let's call these pieces piece A, piece B, and piece C. Okay? Which of the pieces is the biggest? C. So here's C. C is the biggest piece of that marker. That's the UV shell that represents it. Does that look right? No. If that's the biggest, this should be the biggest too, right? If things are proportional. So obviously something's up, right? Doesn't match. Now, let's take a look at how these would come together. All right, because what we can do is try to eliminate seams by sewing things together. I'm going to grab this edge right here on my model, right? I'm just going to double click on it. And you see what it says is this edge here and this edge down here are the same edge. When you select an edge in Maya, the brother and sister edges that should be connected will both light up to tell you that they go together. Does that make sense? It's telling you how they attach. Does this look like it would attach to that well? No, not at all, right? This is way too small. That's way too big. And technically, this edge right here, if I select it, this edge right here is that edge right there. Do they look the same size? No. This confirms that my shells are not the same or correct size relative to each other. That's why the squares are different sizes too. Does that make sense? Different size squares, the proportions of the shells are inaccurate relative to each other. That's what it's showing me. That's what it's telling me. All right. Now, in terms of fixing this, we can fix it. We can make it better. We can improve the quality of the layout. And the way we're going to do that is using some cool tools. Now, what you will notice about these tools is the verbiage that describes the process, and the names of these tools sound a lot like terms that a tailor would use. Because when we are UV mapping and creating textures and stuff for objects, it's kind of like the processes of tailoring. Because basically, human beings, we are a 3D concept, right? Length, width, and depth objects. If you make cloth, cloth is basically a 2D concept, right? If I'm making clothing for a person, I am taking something 2D and I'm cutting it and shaping it to fit nicely over something that's 3D as closely as possible. UV mapping is kind of like that. When we are creating a shell that represents a 3D object, it's kind of like we're making clothes to fit this 3D object. It's the same idea. And that's why when we're UV mapping, there's a lot of similar verbiage in terms of Taylor's tools and actions and what we're doing when we UV map. So we're going to use these tools and we're going to cut fabric where we need to cut it, and we're going to sew fabric where we need to sew it to make it come together. Now, the difference between making a shirt or a suit for somebody or a dress is on actual cloth. When we sew pieces together, there's a seam, right, that separates the cloth where we sewed it together. And where that seam is, you can see it. It's obvious, right? If you guys look, do you see how the pattern is not continuous on my shirt? It stops right at the seam. It's not fluid. You can tell where the seam is because the pattern doesn't continue, right? The difference is when we are working with Maya, when we are sewing UV shells together, where the seam sews together, you can't see anything. It's like invisible magic. It goes away. So what we want to do is sew shells together whenever and wherever we can, as long as the UV layout is still good. The objective is not no seams. Does that make sense? That's never the objective, no seams. The objective is great looking UV layout. So never lose sight of that. No one will ever look at your texture and say, wow, your texture looks like garbage. But did you get rid of all the seams? Oh, good then. Does that make sense? Always good UV layout. Eliminate seams as much as possible. Now, that being said, another part of that is hide the seams whenever possible. Because it's true, there are tools that will help you hide seams. There's a 3D paint tool that would allow you to paint over seams and make them go away. It works kind of like the clone stamp tool in Photoshop. And it will literally paint seams away. But something to be aware of, just like the clone stamp tool, sometimes it doesn't do such a great job. Does that make sense? So as a result, we always try to hide seams just in case we can't fix them, because sometimes we can't. So in terms of hiding seams, again, on my shirt, the seam is down the inside of my torso, not by accident, because my arm typically covers that. So that's where the seam is. We also put seams on the top of shirts because we don't really walk around like this a whole lot. We tend to be upright, so we hide the seams. Does that make sense? We look for transition areas and we put seams there, easier to hide. Does that make sense? So we always put our seams, if we have to have them, someplace inconspicuous. Hide it. Because if we can't attach things, or if we can't use the tools to fix them, no big deal, they're hidden. Does that make sense? So you assume it's not going to work, and you do your best to hide the seams. Does that make sense at all? How are we doing on that? Hell yeah? Okay, good. So let's take a look at these tools and how they work. All right. So first things first, I've determined that this edge here attaches to this edge here. This edge here attaches to here. So basically these two pieces go together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually adjust this thing so it looks like they could go together. I'm going to grab this shell and I'm going to make it bigger. All right. Now, when I look at this shell now, do you see how these edges look almost the same size now? And I made the whole shell bigger to accomplish that. But now this edge looks the same, relatively close to the same size as that edge, right? And this shell looks pretty close to the same size as that shell. Looks like it's a little big. Let me grab that and I'll just take it down a little bit. But do you see how those look like they might actually go together now? and look at the squares. How do they look now? What do you think? How do they look in terms of their size relative to each other? They look more uniform. These look more like those because these shells are now closer to the right size relative to each other. Does that make sense? What the squares were telling us and what that actually means. Because it's very important you understand what's happening. Why am I seeing what I'm seeing? How do I fix it? So now that these are closer to the right shape and size relative to each other, now my squares are looking better. Make sense? So I've moved it into position. I've sized it a little bit so it looked like it would actually connect to each other. Now I'm going to connect it. And to do this, I'm going to use a tool called Move and Sew. And it's a very simple tool to use. You grab one edge and hold shift and double click on the edge on the other end, and that will select all the edges on both sides. Okay. And then under Cut and Sew, if you look in the main menu of your UV editor, you'll see Move and Sew is one of the tools, and it sews them together. All right. Does my texture now fluidly transition from one area to the other? It's connected now, right? There's no seam there anymore. It looks better, right? Yes. Grab one edge, hold shift, and double click on the other one, and it will select all the edges in between those two. And then you use Move and Sew, and that sews them together and eliminates the seam. So now my texture fluidly flows from what was two shells, because now it's one shell. I've eliminated the seam. Okay, so now that's looking better. Now, granted, looking at this, am I looking at squares here or am I looking at rectangles here? A little bit rectangle-y, right? And what that's telling me is that those shells are still not quite as well lined up as they could be in terms of the shape of that shell, right? So what I'm going to do is, because this part looks okay, not perfect, but that's pretty good. This is still looking very rectangle-y. I'm going to grab all of the UVs on this bottom row, and I'm just going to move them a little bit and see if that improves my layout. Do you see how that happened? Watch what I did. I'm looking at rectangles, right? And if I move these guys inward, I get closer to happy squares, which is telling me that the proportions are getting better, right? Top to bottom, left and right. Now I grabbed this bottom row and I moved them up. Why did I choose the bottom row? This was two shells, right? This was one shell and this was the other one. They are lined up right now. So I can change the width of that shell. That's not going to alter anything. Does that make sense? I'm looking at this one and I saw rectangles. So what I'm going to do is grab this row and I'm going to move it up or down because my solution isn't really left and right. It's going to have to be up or down. This was the first shell and that one looks pretty good. So I want this one right there. And again, do I know if it's up or down? I don't. I could go one way. Nope, that's actually worse. So that wasn't the solution. Let me try the other way then. Ah, that's better. Does that make sense? You can literally tinker with the UVs one at a time if you want to get better layout. Does that make sense? All right, let's do another shell. So let's take a look. Here's my other shell right here. This represents what we called A, right? this area here. Now, it looks like rectangles, right? So I don't have happy squares. It looks like it's kind of the right size. It looks a little small here, but I'm gonna try to make them a little bit more square. So using my scale tool, if I squash them, oh, that looks more square-like. Does that make sense? I could have arbitrarily chosen the x-axis and done that also. Just see which one's going to give me the squares. Does that make sense? I didn't know which one it would be. I'd just try one and see if changing the proportions by scale gives me closer to happy squares, which I see that looks pretty good, happy squares. Now still, these are smaller than those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these guys, and if I make them bigger, oh no, that's the wrong way. It's too many. Let me make it smaller. Oh, that's better. Does that make sense? Literally, you just tinker with it and you can see. Now, again, in terms of attaching these things, if I grab one edge, I can see, oh, okay. This edge goes to that edge. Because if I select one edge, the brother and sister edges light up. So these must connect to each other. Let me try. Select this one, hold shift, and select that one. Whoop. All right. Again, this edge and this edge selected. Cut and sew and choose, move and sew. And it connects them together. Does that make sense? Okay. Now it looks like I've got a little bit of distortion here. And it represents this row right here. These guys. Let me see if I move them a little bit, if that makes any difference. That's not bad. Let me see if I change their scale at all. Does that make any difference? No. That's not bad. All right. So I'm getting my layout. It's looking pretty good. Things are starting to come together. Things are connecting to each other now, a little bit more smoothly, a little bit more fluidly. The square sizes are a little bit off. Looks like this proportion's a little bit off compared to that, but I'm doing pretty well. I've got a fair UV layout. Does that make sense? All right, now, something that I want to show you guys about connecting shells to each other. You'll notice that when I was connecting shells to each other, I was sizing them first, bringing them close to where they're supposed to go, and then once they look like they would go together well, then that's when I connected them to each other. You don't have to do that. You don't have to. Let's say I'll get these back to where they were all apart. Oh, that's all I can get. All right. So let's say I want to attach these together. So I grab this one, double click that one. Didn't size it, didn't move them near each other. They could be on opposite ends of the universe and it doesn't make any difference. And if I go to cut and sew and choose move and sew, it will move those pieces together and they will connect. Does that make sense? It will literally do that for you. Now, in this instance, that doesn't even, That doesn't look as good as I was hoping. Hold on 1 second. All right. Let's take these guys again. These guys here. And these guys here. Again, I can select this one, select that one, move in so, and it will connect them. But how's my UV layout look? That looks bad, right? So you might think when you select two shells and sew them together, you'd be like, oh no, that's not good. That looks terrible. I must not be able to connect those shells to each other because they look bad when I sew them together. But the reality of the situation is, no, they did look better before because I sized them first. I made sure they were going to fit together. So when I did sew them together, it looked better. So this is misleading. And that's why I suggest, as beginners, bring the shells near each other. Size them up so they look like they would connect, and try that because I think it's going to help. So rather than just kind of, move and sew everything and hope for the best, let's grab these shells. Let's get them close to the size we need, where they connect. Bring them close to where they're going to go. Size them up. And then connect them. Move in so. Looks good. Again, let's grab this one. Grab the faces, because this connects to that. Get it ballpark where it's going to go. Let's size it up. Line it up. I'm not even looking over here. I'm just looking at these shells and how they come together. Nope. Move in so. Boop. And then once I got those shells together, again, I might be able to make some manipulation. I'm looking at rectangles here, and I know I don't want to go this way with it. I'm going to grab this, and it's going to be up or down, and I don't know which until I try it. Try to get some good squares there. So I'm getting better layout. Does that make sense? Okay, so now layout seems to be improved. Things are getting better. They're going in the right direction. But again, the UV mapping process isn't just, okay, I've got to map it out and make happy squares. I mean, that's what we want to do ultimately, of course. But one thing that's very important is, well, what does the texture look like? What texture is going to be applied to this thing? Because that helps me make smart decisions about where to put seams and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in terms of my UV layout. So if I'm looking at this marker and the name of the marker is Markero, the greatest marker ever, right? We're doing an ad for that. And this marker says Markero right here, right on the side. And that's the only place where we see any kind of logo or tagline or whatever. That's going to go right here. Does that make sense? All right. Now, in terms of putting that on there, if we're going to create text to put on a texture, right? We're going to use an application like Photoshop, something like that. And Photoshop or whatever application you're using will create the words that you type in, and it makes them linearly, right? It makes them in a straight line. So if I want to make that logo Markero, the greatest marker ever, right? whatever application I'm going to use, it's going to create it linearly like that. Does that make sense? Because that's how text is created. Now, if I'm going to put it on this UV shell, because that's what those shells do, it's going to be really easy to put Markero, the greatest marker ever, right there because it's straight. Does that make sense? That's going to be super easy. Also, if I have to put Markero, let's say it goes this way, Markero, the greatest marker ever, it's going to run this direction. So I could turn the text pretty easily. It's still going to run straight. And because this is sewn together, it's still going to look good. Does that make sense? So do I have to sew those seams together right there? Well, maybe, maybe not. It depends. In the instance where it goes this way, definitely that's going to be a problem if I don't sew them together. So I know I've got to make that work. If it's right here, maybe, maybe not. Or what if this is one solid color? I might not need to at all. Does that make sense? That's what dictates what seams do I sew, what seams do I not sew. How important is it that the UV layout is perfect? Well, what's going on there? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, next thing I want to talk about in terms of this cutting and sewing. Let's say I'm doing a commercial, not a commercial. We're doing a magazine ad or a poster for Markero, the greatest marker ever. If it's on a poster, if it's in a magazine, are we talking about a still image or an image that moves? It's a still image, right? It's a picture. So if I'm creating an image for a magazine or a poster, and we'll say that for the Markero ad, this is the angle I'm looking at. That's the picture that's going to be in the magazine or on the poster or whatever. This is going to be fine for my UV layout because it looks good. I don't see any seams. It's going to do what I need it to do. I can have Markero written on the side here. I can have Markero written over there. It doesn't make any difference. I'm covered, right? But what happens if I'm doing a commercial, right? I'm doing an ad for Markero, the greatest marker ever. And the camera movement looks like this. We start a little bit wide. Markero, the greatest marker ever. Fabulous for everything. Oh, what's that right there? What is that? Do you guys see that? Let's go to our UV editor. What we are looking at, I'll make it easier to see. What are we looking at right there? A seam. That's a seam, like the seam on my shirt. That UV shell, because anything that's 3D and we have to cut it and lay it out flat, you know, like our cardboard tube or whatever, there's gonna be a seam. There's an edge right there. And I moved it to make it more obvious. But you can see with that seam right there, that's on camera. The camera's going to settle on that. That's the end of the camera movement. So is that good placement for a seam? What do you think? Let's put it to a vote. How many of you think that's good placement for a seam? How many of you think that is bad placement for a seam? Yay, the bads have it. That's bad placement for the seam because the camera's going to see that. Where would be a better place for me to put the seam? On the bottom of the marker, right? Because I don't ever see down there. So I need to move the seam. Where it is right now is not working for me. Most likely I'm going to have a seam, but where do I have it? That's the important part. I can move that thing. So let's take a look at how do we move a seam. So again, it's right here. I don't want it there. I want to move it. So here's what I'm going to do. I'd like the seam to be down here where I won't see it. So if I select the edges, because if I look at this, I'm not really sure where that would be. So I'm going to come over here and just select the edges. Click, click, click. All right. You guys see where I'm trying to move the seam to? on the bottom of the marker. And if I look over here, oh, that corresponds to this couple of edges. So here's where I'm going to use the cut tool. And I'm literally just going to cut the fabric. I'm going to make a seam there. So I go to cut and sew and I choose cut. And that creates a seam. Now, this is literally 2 shells now, just like before it was 3 shells. Right now it's 2. And it's kind of hard to grab one because they are still like right on top of each other. So do you guys remember I gave you a trick for grabbing a shell by grabbing just one UV? You guys remember how to do that? I'm going to take that as a big no. If you grab one UV in a UV shell, and again, just because it's difficult to grab what you want without grabbing some stuff that you didn't want, and you're like, how do I get that separate? Grab just one UV in the shell, hold down the command key on your keyboard, left and right of the space bar, and then the right mouse button, choose to UV shell. And that's going to allow you to grab just that one shell. Do you see how I can get that one piece now? All right. And what I'm going to do is literally take that shell and hold on, let me get this back over here so you can see it. I'm going to take this shell and I'm going to just drag it to the other side of this object. Right. I'm going to get it really close to where it's going to go. And guess what I'm going to use? Move and sew. Yeah. So I'm going to go to edge mode, select the edges that I'd like to connect. And then under cut and sew, go to move and sew. Boop. And sew them together. So now my seam is on the bottom where I'll never see it. So when I go through this camera move, Markero, the greatest marker ever. There's no seam visible. And again, because I've been given storyboards, and every artist who's working on this thing has been given a set of storyboards, I know what the project has to do, and therefore I can make smarter decisions for what I'm doing. Does that make sense? I have to make that choice because it's not, you know, well, put the seams where you think. There's a rationale behind it. This is a thinking process. It's not ABC, it's done. It's a riddle. It's something you've got to figure out. Well, where do I put the seams to best suit what I need it to do? Does that make sense? Okay. So again, this is better for what I want if I'm doing a commercial. Print ad, the seam was fine where it was. But if I see both sides, I got to fix that. Does that make sense? Huh? All right, cool. So this is better. I can actually move forward and make a texture for this. And it's not going to be too hard. It's going to look pretty good. Make sense? Okay. Let's look at another idea, because this UV layout is pretty good. This is going to work. But we can make it better. Oop, we just did that. Boop. All right. Improving the quality of the shells. Are there any tools in Maya that will help me create a better layout? How do I improve what I'm doing? Yes, I can map it using the right tools. Yes, I can play with the UVs on an individual basis, one at a time, or rows of them. I can scale them, just move them, whatever, to make it look better. I can absolutely, just like you can move a vertice, I can make adjustments. But are there any tools to help me do a better job? And the answer to that is absolutely. There's some tools that Maya has that can help you improve the quality of your UV layout. Now, I liken the process to ironing. How many of you guys have ever ironed a button-down shirt? Oh, I hate ironing shirts. It is the worst, right? There's so many things on there that you got to get the wrinkles out of. So if you're like me and you hate ironing, you take that shirt and you throw it in the dryer and you let it bang around on high heat first, right? Let it bang around in there. Get out as many wrinkles as you can. And then take it out, and then you got to spot iron the things that need more attention. Get the collars, the venting in the sleeves, the vent between the shoulder blades, and get that stuff done as like a specialty around the buttons, obnoxious stuff, right? So in Maya, we have a tool that works kind of like that. And it basically, we use it to knock out as many wrinkles as we can, and then we can go in and spot iron things that aren't looking so great. And it uses basically a mathematical formula or algorithm to figure out what makes it look better. Because basically what it does is it says, okay, here's the geometry. Here's the UV shells you've created. How can I make the proportional relationship of the faces on the geometry look more like the proportional relationship on the faces of the UV shells? So it basically uses mathematical or algorithm to make it better. You have to take it, you know, some of the way. It's not like, hey, Maya, I screwed up totally. Can you just bail me out and do the work? Awesome. You got to get it most of the way there. But Maya will pick it up and actually make it better. And we're going to use this tool. It's called the Smooth UVs tool. And what I love about the Smooth UVs tool is it's not just you select it, you apply the math, and then boop, it's done. What I love about it is there's like an interactive slider so that you can apply the tool and just slide it and watch what it's doing. And at any point you can stop and go, oh, looks good there, I like it. Go past that. Oh, that looks good. No, it looked better over here. And you can literally go through that and find good layout. Does that make sense? And that's what I really like about it. So let's take a look at this tool and how we can use it. All right. So again, the smooth UVs and the unfold capacity of it are awesome for fixing those UV shells. So let's play with those guys. All right. So we're going to work with the same thing, this marker, and we're going to work with this same piece of shell here. Now you can see this looks pretty good, this layout. But let's see what this Smooth UVs tool does for us. So the first thing I'm going to do to use the Smooth UVs tool is I'm going to grab the entire shell all at one time. This is like throwing it in the dryer, iron the whole thing. And I'm going to go to my tools, and you'll see this smooth tool. Boop. All right. Now, in terms of the tool, you'll see it has an unfold capacity and it has a relax capacity, because it does both. I don't really find I have as much success with the relax as I do with the unfold. So I'm going to show you the unfold. So the way we do this is you hover your cursor over the word unfold and hold down the left mouse button, and then you drag your mouse left or right. And what happens is it starts applying the math and it changes the shell. And at any point you can stop. So you can just sort of move through it and watch it as it evolves into the final layout if you go all the way to the right. Now, in terms of my UV layout, this is fully applied, the tool fully applied. Do my squares look like they are pretty close to the same size? Yeah, they do. Dang close. Do my squares fluidly flow from one to the next? They do. That's a pretty sweet transition. They look pretty good. However, one big minus, you see how my texture has kind of a weird angle on it now? That's weird. But in Maya's opinion, using this algorithm, that is a more accurate depiction of that. And if I took this piece of plastic off of that marker and cut it and laid it out flat, if in truth be told, it probably would look more like that. Does that make sense? That is more likely what I would see. So Maya's not crazy, but I do have kind of this weird angle to my checkers. So now the question is, looking at this UV layout, if I had to put text on my marker again, Markero, the greatest marker ever, would that be harder because it's curved? It would, because my text comes out linearly. If I'm trying to match this up, my text will be too close on the ends and too far in the middle. So what I would end up having to do is use tools to warp the text to make it fit the curvature of my UV shell. The problem with that is if I distort the shape, I'm going to distort the font of the letters. It's going to change the way it looks. And companies do not like it when you change their font in terms of what they look like, right? Because it's going to have to turn it into a graphic and then make a distortion of it. So likely that's not going to look as good. Does that make sense? So in terms of, I'll come right back, I promise. In terms of things that I'm thinking about, again, that's probably more accurate. But if I've got to put text on that, that could look worse. So maybe my previous layout was better for that purpose. Whereas this one, maybe if it's just one solid color, that would be better. Or maybe I'm going to take this geometry into another application like ZBrush or something and put some scratches and dings in it or some embossment or something like that, some kind of logo or something that sticks out, you know, some kind of graphic. Probably more accurate layout would be better for that purpose. So again, you just kind of have to take a look at, well, what's happening with this texture? Because that answers a lot of questions about how do I lay it out well for the job it has to fulfill. Does that make sense? Because it's got a job to do. It's not just pretty. It has a job to do, and I have to make sure I've built it in such a way that it can do its job to the best of its ability. Go ahead. What was your question? Did you? Okay. Was it funny? Okay. What? It would change it. Well, first of all, what you have to remember is the texture is an image and the UVs just represent the surface of the geometry. So they're not connected to each other. So if I change the shape of the shell, that doesn't change the shape of the texture. Does that make sense? So that would not, you couldn't leave it straight, create the texture for it, and then alter it. Yeah, that wouldn't work. So once your UV layout is final, that's when you move forward and create your texture. Does that make sense? And if you change the shape of your shells, that will absolutely affect the texture. And we'll look at that today too. It's a good question though. That's a good question. How do those things come together? How's that work? So in this instance, yeah, that's probably more accurate. But if I have to create text that's created linearly, that's going to be hard to do on a curved shell. So maybe that's not the best for me. Here's something in the middle. What if I do this? What if I unfold it to a certain degree and wait until it looks pretty good and it's still relatively straight? Okay, what if I leave it there and then I grab these UVs here and using my scale tool, I level them out, make them flatter, grab those guys, level them out, grab these guys, level them out, grab these guys, level them out, and then maybe grab these guys. I'm seeing some distortion in there. Maybe I need to move them up a little bit. Maybe move this down a little bit. No, up was the solution. Does that make sense? Now I'm doing something kind of in the middle. I've still got pretty good layout. Pretty good, pretty evenly spaced squares. They look pretty decent. And I've still got a shell that's relatively linear to apply a texture. Does that make sense? This is also a possibility. So what you have to ask yourself, again, is which one gives me the best result for what I need it to do? And that's why it is very important for you to understand when it comes to UV mapping, it's not ABC, it's done. It's literally, it's a riddle you have to figure out. What gives me the best layout? What do I need it to do? And therefore, what can I do to try to get that? Yes?
So are you saying this is all for the sake, like resizing it is all for the sake of the text? Or is it just for something?
Based on what the texture is asking for. Does that make sense? Because what you have to do is you have to look at what's the end product. What will this thing look like when it's all done? And again, they're going to give you samples to work from. You're going to look at that thing and go, okay, there's a texture on part of this marker. You know, there's text on it, or there's a picture of a tiger or whatever, you know, and there's stuff on this marker. So how will that affect the way I choose to lay out my UVs? Does that answer your question, or did I miss?
No, yeah, it does, but I'm just wondering, like, how does it originally, like you have to edit its original format. So, I mean, you can do anything with the text. It's just like originally, like, scale, like, when you had it the first time before, you just, like...
Yeah, when it was in a brick or when it was curved? When the shell was curved?
Before all that.
Before all that, okay.
So it's like the first time that you got done on
Yep.
the shells.
Mm-hmm.
And you just put the text on there.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't see why, like, the point of the curve.
Well, you ideally you want the best possible layout you can create, but it also has to do the job that it has to do. So in terms of the first layout I had where it was perfectly square, it looked pretty good. Not perfect, but pretty good. And in terms of applying text in a linear fashion to that UV shell, that would have been pretty easy. When I used the Smooth UVs tool, it smoothed everything out and those squares looked awesome, but then my shell had a weird curve to it. So it's hard to take linearly generated text and make it fit a curved UV shell. So it's going to distort the text a little bit. It's going to stretch in some areas and pinch in others. Otherwise, it won't fit. Right? So now this is between both of those. In terms of the quality of the layout, that's better than my first layout. Not as good as my second one, but better than the first. And it's got that linear component so that if I have to make text that goes straight across, I got that part too. So what I was hoping that you guys would glean from all this is that when you're UV mapping, no two objects UV map the same, and you may map it more than one time to find the right solution for what you need. Does that make sense? There's no, I got to UV it. Okay, select the faces, cylindrical, awesome, I'm done. You have to think about what kind of texture you have to create for this thing. How is this object being used? How do you make textures for what I need to do? So therefore, how does that govern my choices? Because there are always choices. There are always decisions you have to make. And if you make the right ones or the best ones, you're going to have to redo your work less often. Does that make sense? Because if you just go, I'm going to unfold my UVs. It's perfect. I got happy squares. It's kind of a weird shaped shell, but whatever, we're good. And then you show that to your lead on the project, your art supervisor is going to look at that and go, yeah, but we're going to distort the text if we do that. You're going to have to re-UV map that. Does that make sense? But better if you figure that out before you get to that stage. Does that make sense? Because now you got more work to do and less time to do it. Does that make sense at all? It's all about making good calls, because bad calls means more work for you to do. So you got to be on, well, what's this need to do? What do I need this thing to do? So that you can make better decisions and redo work less often, which is a part of working smarter, not harder. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Can you do, I'm not sure I understand your question. Can you do it smaller size? Because you can shrink your shells or make them larger to whatever size you want.
So, like, if the curve doesn't work
Oh yeah, could you do that? Yeah, you could use the unfold tool on one shell and not another one. Um, there may be some distortion where you tried to sew those two pieces together, because if you take something that's rectangular and something that's curved and you sew them together, something's going to have to give. Does that make sense? Something will distort to match one another. Does that make sense a little bit? Okay. So similarly shaped items sew together neatly and cleanly with less distortion. So if you've got one shell that looks totally different than the one that it's supposed to attach to, you're going to get a little distortion in there as a result. Does that make sense? Okay. So, but could you look into that as an option? Absolutely. There's no limit to the amount of tweaking you can do to try to make it do what you need it to do. And again, I just hoping that you guys are realizing that UV mapping is not ABC. It's done. Literally, you have to figure it out and make smart calls so that you don't have to do it again. Because if you UV map something wrong and your supervisor doesn't catch it, you could be in the texturing phase and then you realize that something's not working, and then you got to go back and UV map the object and then go make another texture, because you literally and figuratively paint yourself into a corner, and you don't want to do that. So what you want to do is make good calls in advance so that you don't make extra work for yourself. And it's just about making smart calls. It's a good question though. Yeah. The goal for your UV mapping is to, as accurately as possible, represent that 3D surface in 2D, which is like a real map does, right? When you're looking at a real map, the most important thing is the map is as close to reality as possible. Because if the map is inaccurate, people will get lost or hurt, and you will get sued, and that's a bummer. So you want them to match as closely as possible. But, 100% perfect accuracy, the likelihood of that is not really there, but really, really close is what you want. Does that make sense? And there's a big difference between trying to make a map of the Earth on a globe, which the globe is already very close to the same shape as the Earth, easier to get perfect accuracy. Does that make sense? Versus a flat map of the entire Earth, very hard to get 100% accuracy, because we are taking something that's 3D and we're trying to represent it in 2. So there's the challenge. Does that make sense at all? Okay. If it doesn't, you can tell me. You won't hurt my feelings. Oh, good questions, though. I like it. But is this making sense in terms of what we're doing and why? Again, rationalizing what I need to do to get the best possible layout. Okay. All right. So now, UV mapping's looking good. I laid out all of my shells. I see nice happy squares. It looks like it's going to work for what I need the texture to do. I've used my move and sew to eliminate seams wherever possible. Tried to make it look as good as I can. Then ultimately what we do is we take all the shells that we've created, and again, all the squares are the same size, and we shrink them down and we put them into the 0 to 1 space, right? Because remember, we talked about the whole idea that the workspace is kind of like our desktop where we're doing all of our work, and when we're done, we frame everything. We put it in a nice, pretty frame, and that's the 0 to 1 space. So all of my shells fit into this 0 to 1 space, right? And in terms of the texturing process, what we would do then is come in and literally paint, and this is the only time you'll ever hear me say this, you have to stay inside the lines, because literally the shell is your guide. So where you paint, that's what colors are going to show through onto your character or whatever it is you've UV mapped. So when you color those shells, the colors transfer to your object. So if you paint in between shells, that you're never going to see that. That's not going to show up on your model. But if you color inside the shell, that's going to show up on your model. Does that make sense? Literally, whatever the shell has in it is what ends up on your object, whatever it happens to be. All right. Now, in terms of these shells, again, they represent the 3D surface here. And like I said, it's kind of like paint by numbers. You paint in these areas and they show up there. We don't actually paint it in Maya. We have different applications which allow us to apply color information, that texture in terms of the painting. What we do is, if we're using Photoshop as our means of creating the texture, what we do literally is take a picture of the 0 to 1 space. It's called a UV snapshot. And then we take that image into Photoshop and we literally paint. We use these lines as a guide because the lines come over with the image, and we paint. Make that yellow, that's his hand, make that yellow, that's his hand, make that yellow. And then those colors appear on the model because we create an image, a texture, which we then apply to the geometry so that it knows what color to be based on what we've established here. Does that make sense? That is the way the process typically works. We model an object, we lay out its UVs, we then take those UVs, we bring them into Photoshop, an image of the UV layout, an image of the 0 to 1, and we paint over the lines the colors that we want, or we apply the textures where we want them to be. And then we bring an image out of Photoshop and we apply it to our geometry. We also can use Substance Painter. I don't know how many of you guys have heard of that, but that's an application where we bring our model right into Substance Painter and we paint, and it starts creating that stuff for us. That's pretty cool too. But both of them require good UV layout. So UV layout is a thing. If you are modeling with polygons, you must UV map your objects. So you must get good at this. And that's why we're going over it so hardcore, because you will be UV mapping all of your polygon geometry from here forward. You have to do it. Does that make sense? Even in the industry, modelers do their own UV mapping. You have to. You're responsible for that. So we have to learn how to do this process. And you'll get plenty of opportunities to practice, because every class after this, when you're modeling with polygons, you'll be mapping too. So you will get more opportunities to learn this. But I really want you to get it in here so that you can move forward with leaps and bounds in the other classes. Does that make sense? Good, hell yeah? Good, good, good. All right, so let's talk about this texture process and how it works, because we're going to apply some textures, but one very small but very important difference. As I told you before, we model, we UV map and lay out our UVs, and then we paint textures, and that's the way it works. We paint inside the lines. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to paint textures. We used to teach the texturing process also, but I don't have enough time in my class to do it. But at one point we did teach that. You will get that in other classes as you go through the program, shading and lighting in particular. But since we don't have time to paint textures together, we made textures for you in advance. And so again, you don't usually paint the texture first and then make the shells fit. It's the other way around. So, but in the interest of time, we did the textures first. Now, in terms of where do you put textures when you want to bring them into Maya? You put your texture images in the same folder as you put your source images folders, your source images. Maya goes to the source images folder by default to find images to bring into Maya for modeling. Maya by default goes to the source images folder to find images to apply to materials as texture. So the same folder does both of those jobs. So what we did was we painted textures for you in advance, and then we put them in the source images folder of your activity file folder. And that's one of the many reasons we have to set our project, because not only for modeling purposes, because that's how the image planes come in, but that's how textures come in too. So if you don't set your project, Maya can't find the images, it can't connect these things to each other, and you'll get, you know, all kinds of warnings about I can't find the texture. I know the material is calling for it and I don't know where it is. So again, one of the many reasons we set our projects so that the textures can be found as well. So we have already set our projects to the activity file folder. So now all we have to do is open up that file that we were working on last class. And again, the images are already in the source images, so we can bring those in. You guys remember the file we were working on last class? It was a plane, a cube, and a cylinder, and we UV mapped those. We left them with like a checker pattern on them. Well, now we're going to apply textures so you can see how that works. So let's get into the steps of how to apply. Again, we've already set our project, so we're good there. So we just need to open up the file. Again, I hope you saved it from last time. File, open scene. And I have my UV mapping activity. I just put done at the end so that I know that's a completed one. All right, there's my 3 pieces of geometry: the plane, the cube, and the sphere, cylinder. And again, remember, because these are different objects, it's okay if the squares are different sizes. That doesn't make any difference within a scene. What is important for our class is if this plane was like a lid on top of this cube, like something that opened and closed, it would be a part of that cube, then it would have to have the same size squares, because then it would, the proportions would be wrong. The resolution of the images would be wrong. So, but luckily this is a separate piece, so it doesn't matter if the squares are different sizes. All right, so we want to apply texture images to our geometry. So these are the steps. And you're going to notice that they're very similar to other things that we've done already, because repetition is a cornerstone of learning. So that's why we do these things again and again. So if we want to apply a texture to an object, step 1 is create a new material. So we go to Windows, Rendering Editor's Hypershade, because that's where all the materials live. And I'm going to make a new material. I choose Lambert, boop, and it makes a brand new Lambert. And in my attribute editor, again, which is this icon here with the screwdrivers, or you can click on the tab on the side that says attribute editor. Here's where I'm going to highlight it, and I'm going to call it my plane material, because this is the material that I'm going to apply to my plane. Now, when we wanted to connect the checker pattern, which is also a texture, when we were trying to connect that to the material, how do we do that? How do we do that? You guys remember? I went to the color channel and I went to the checker box at the end, right? So that's step 2. Go to the checker box and click on it with the left mouse button, the color channel checker box. All right, and that opens up the create render node. Now previously we went to the checker pattern, right? That was number 2 on the list, but we need a different node. We need the node that'll allow us to bring pictures in. So we're going to go to the node called file. The file node is the one that lets you bring pictures in. So you click on the file. And you'll notice that this sample is jet black because it doesn't know what picture to put in there. However, if you look under file attributes, you'll see it says image name and it's blank. That's why there's no picture in there. It doesn't know what to put in there. But lucky for us, there's a little yellow folder. You guys remember, what do little yellow folders do? What do those things do? I bet Brian remembers. It takes you on a pathway. It tells you where things are. It's like a map. Tell me where this picture is. That's what Maya's saying. I don't know where the picture is. Help me find the path for it. So what I'll do is I will click on this yellow folder, and then because I set my project, Maya immediately goes to my activity file folder, and then immediately goes to my source images folder and says, well, which one do you want? Again, one of the many reasons we set projects. So now I'm going to choose my plane texture, which is this adorable monkey, and I hit open. So now the sample has a picture, there's a name and a path, so Maya can find it. Does that make sense? All good. Everybody's happy now. So now all we have to do is apply this magical material to my geometry plane. So that's step 4. How do I do that? Middle mouse button is one of many ways to apply a material. Hold down the middle mouse button, drag and drop. All right. Now look. Yay. My monkey. All right. Now, what's cool about this is when you look at it, you would say, wow, look at the model. This person modeled frame around that picture, and it looks really cool. There's no modeling going on there. Look at this thing. It's a geometry plane. There's zero detail there. But the texture makes it look that way. Because when you look at that texture and you see highlights and you see shadow, your brainy parts in your eyeball say that sticks out. Does that make sense? That is one of the coolest aspects of texturing when it comes to modeling. You can fake detail that your geometry cannot support. It's like illusion, which is one of the more fun aspects of texturing because you can totally trick people. It's a dragon. Nope, it's a cube. And the texture does all the work. So this looks a lot more detailed than it really is. And that's what makes it super fun. Now, if you look at my texture, though, you can see my frame looks a little cut off on the bottom. Looks pretty good on the top, but let's take a look in my UV editor and see. So I open up my UV editor and I select my geometry. And if I look in my 0 to 1 space, do you see how my UVs don't quite go all the way to the bottom of my 0 to 1? Do you guys see that? I've got some texture down here that's not inside the shell. So something I can do is I can literally select those UVs right there and just kind of drag them down a little bit to get the rest of that frame in there. Does that make sense? And now that looks better out here. So even after you've created the texture, there's still a little bit of flexibility. You can grab these UVs and kind of move them a little bit and make sure everything fits as it should. Make it look good. Does that make sense? Okay, now, important things to realize. If my UV shell is not in the 0 to 1, watch what happens. I'm going to drag it out. Do you remember me telling you? When you assign an image to a material as a texture, the 0 to 1 is where Maya goes by default to figure out that color information and its specific placement. Outside of the 0 to 1, it just repeats. The same texture just repeats again and again and again. Now, if I make it bigger, it becomes more obvious what I'm talking about. Does that make sense? So what we want to make sure of is that our UV shells, again, for this class, our UV shells have to fit within the 0 to 1 space when we're all done. So obviously that's one of the things I'm looking for, grading criteria for UV mapping. Does that make sense? Good, hell yeah? Good. All right. How are my digital friends doing, Brian?
They're all over it.
Awesome. So let's do the cube. All right, we're going to do that one next. And here's, I'm going to actually grab these shells and just drag them all out of the 0 to 1 right now. Just put them over there. And again, the steps for applying a texture, they're going to be the same. First, we create a new material. Windows, Rendering Editor's Hypershade. I'm in the Hypershade. I'm going to make a new material. So I click Lambert. This is going to be my cube material. Oh, my fingers are getting cold. The typing's getting bad. I got my cube material. I know, you got to like jump around, jump up, and get down. All right. So I go to my next step 2. I go to my color channel and I click on the checker box. And that takes me to the create render node. And then which node do we want? The file node. So we go to file and click on it. The node loads, but it doesn't know what picture to put in there. So how do I tell Maya which picture? The yellow folder teaches Maya the path to the image, whatever it happens to be. So I click on the yellow folder, and I'm going to choose my cube texture and apply that. So now I've got this material with the cube texture on it. How do I apply it to the cube? Go ahead. Middle mouse button drag. One of many ways to apply it. Now, when I look at the texture on there, oh, it looks like something's up, right? So let's take a look at the UV editor and see what's up. What's up? So here's my texture where it's supposed to be. And if I look, a cube has 6 sides. And of course, this texture has 6 sort of images as well. So odds are pretty good that there's a side of this cube for each texture. And you see, yep, I got 6 out here, but again, they're out here, and that's why they're not lining up properly. So what I need to do is apply these shells to the appropriate image. So this is the front of my cube. I select this face, and this face lights up. So this must be that face. So if I look at my texture, which one of these texture images do you think is the front view of what it is we're looking at? What do you think? What's the front view? Probably this monkey looking right at us, right? That's the front of the thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this shell and drag it over and place it right on top of the monkey that's looking at us, because that's going to be the front of the cage. And if you look at that, tell me that doesn't look like a 3D environment with depth. It's just a texture. That's it. So pretty obvious, again, why these textures are so cool. All right, so the monkey's in there. He's in his cage. Let's do the top face, right? So I grab this face on the top. It corresponds to this shell here. Which one of these images do you think is the top of my monkey cage? What do you think? This one's already got a job. Probably this one. That looks like that's probably the top. So I'm going to take this and drag it over there. And again, line it up as best I'm able. And then now the monkey cage has a top. Let's do this side here. So here's the side. Corresponds to this shell. Here's a side view here. So I'm going to take this image and put it over the side view of the monkey. Wallet thief. All right. And then let's do the back. Again, this image here has a back view of the monkey. So I'm just going to take that shell and put it over the monkey in the back. Line that up neatly. All right, here's the bottom. And again, I've only got 2 things left, this one or this one. That looks like the bottom, so I'm going to put that up over there. Line it up. All right, and then I've only got 1 side left. And that's this one, and I'm going to bring it over there and drop it on. Line it up as best I'm able. Awesome. What's wrong with it? It's reverse, right? You ever see anything in a mirror that looks backwards? This monkey is in serious regnad. But what should it be? Should be danger, right? Well, here's the thing. That shell, it's got good accurate layout, but the problem is it's upside down. It got flipped. All right? It's backwards, and that's why it looks like a mirror image, right? Now, big question, and this is a hard one because I'm going to ask you about something that happened 2 days ago. Actually, more than 2 days ago. No, it was 3 days ago. So something that happened 3 days ago. How do you think this shell ended up upside down? Because that's what it is. It is upside down. But only the smartest of the smarts will realize this. Why is it upside down?
When you were like scaling it for like perfect squares, you probably took one of the sides and went up like all the way through it and kind of went through the opposite side.
That would do that. What you're talking about, that would actually end up with that result. That's not what I did, but that would give you that result. That's very smart.
When you were scanning the planes, like, so it wasn't facing, the move tool wasn't like facing outwards, it was facing like back.
You're exactly right. Do you guys remember when I was UV mapping the cube? We took a UV map of one of the faces and it was in X and the arrow was pointing right at us and we did X. But when we did the other side of the cube, the arrow was on the inside of the cube. So although we took the picture on X, we didn't take it from here. We took it from inside the cube. So we took a picture of the inside of that face, not the outside, because there was no negative X as an option for the tool. Does that make sense? Good for you. So it was backwards because the way we took that picture. And I think Maya uses the normals to determine that in terms of which way it's facing.
So mine looks weird. So it says wallet thief, but the monkey is backwards. Like I can read it, but the monkey is like opposite. I don't know. It's flipped. Like your monkey looks like he's facing that way, but my monkey looks.
Well, but does yours say Regnad? Because there's a monkey on both sides. One side says wallet thief and the other says Regnad. Oh, does it? So you have a different shell facing the wrong direction, and that's okay. So let's take a look at how we fix this because it's super easy. Number one, how do we figure out our shells are backwards? Number two, how do we fix them? Number one, unless there's text on there, you would never know if the shell was backwards, right? You noticed because your monkey's facing the wrong direction. But again, deductive reasoning helps you see that. You might not recognize that. So how do I tell if my shells are backwards? Maya actually has a tool that will tell you when your shells are backwards. In your UV editor, if you go to Monkey Town, if you go to View, you will see there's two choices, wireframe or shaded up at the top. If you choose shaded, boop, Maya will shade your UV shells. The ones that are red are facing the wrong way. The ones that are blue are facing the right way. So what we have to do is fix the ones that are red. That helped? Good. So let's see, how do we fix it? Part two. We're going to use a tool called the flip tool, oddly enough. So what we're going to do is select the face, and then under modify, just choose flip. And it will literally flip it from red to blue. Select the face, modify, flip it. Select the face. Select the face, modify, flip it. And then now it reads danger, like it's supposed to. All right? So, another important requirement. When we are laying out our UVs, we want them all to be facing blue, right? Now, again, for our class, we want all of our shells to have their own space. They're not overlapping each other. And we want them to all be blue, and we want them to all be in the 0 to 1. These are the requirements for good UV layout for our class. So when we are grading the stuff that you have UV mapped, what do you think we're looking for? Make sure they're facing the right way, blue. Make sure they're all inside the 0 to 1. Make sure we're looking at happy squares that are all the same size. Is that making sense? All the little things we've learned how to do. That's what we're looking for when we're grading your UV layout, when you're doing your projects, right? So now this is what we call collage UV layout, right? All the shells have their own little space. They're not touching each other. They're not overlapping each other. They all got their own little area within the 0 to 1. In other instances, not this class, but in other instances, you do want to put your shells on top of each other, and it's actually helpful. For example, let's say, you see this texture right here that looks kind of like a crate? Let's say I take these shells and I just put them on top of each other like this. All right, just put them on top of each other. If you look at my object, look, it has the same texture on all sides. So in the interest of efficiency, in some instances, you want your shells on top of each other. That's stacked UV layout. Does that make sense? Because whatever you put the shell over, that's what shows up on the geometry. So if you put several shells, they all show the same thing. That's just an efficiency thing. Why not have just one texture and do them all? Why paint 6 spaces that look the same? That's a waste of space. Make sense? Okay, so this is stacked UVs. Again, this is not what we're doing in our class, but that is something you can do. It's not against the rules. It just depends on the game you're playing, right? The game we're playing, we don't want that. We want them all to have their own little space. All right, but we do want them blue. Make sense? Hell yeah? Okay, cool. Hi, Sarah. Your shirt says killer. What's that indicative?
Killer and the Suspects.
Oh dear. All right. All right, so let's do our cylinder, last object. Again, this is something we've done several times now, so you should be good at it. What's the first thing we do? We're going to apply a texture to it, so we go to the Hypershade. I knew I could drag it out of you. Window, rendering editors, Hypershade. Hypershade opens up and we do a what in there? Make a new material. That's right. We make a new material. Oh boy. It's like pulling teeth today. All right. Cylinder material. All right. Now, how do I apply my texture to it? I go to the checker box on what channel? The color channel. So I go over here and I click on the checker box and it opens up the create render node. Which render node do I want? File is correct. So I go to file and I click on it. And Maya says, great. You want to put an image into the color channel. Which one? What do I do? Under file, under file attributes, I go to the yellow folder and I teach Maya the path to the picture I want. I click on it. In this case, I use my cylinder texture and apply that. So now I've got this groovy material. What do I do? Middle mouse button, drag it and drop it. So now this object is made of that material. Now, things are not lining up great. So obviously I'm gonna have to move some stuff around. So I'm gonna go to the UV editor. What's wrong with this face? Let's flip it, right? Flip it good, because it's red. We don't do red, we do blue. Where do I go? Modify, flippancy. All right. Now I'd like this to be the top of my can, right? And I can see that it's this one right here. So I'm going to move this out of the way because right now that's not what I want. And I'm going to move this also. Again, this is the top of my can and that's the bottom. So what I'm going to have to do is grab, oop, I didn't get everybody. Grab that shell and move it so that it is over the top of the can part of the texture. So that's looking good. And then I want the bottom of the can down here. So I'm going to grab this guy and bring it, line it up. All right. Now the middle of my can is supposed to have this lovely label on it. So what I'm going to have to do is grab this piece here and I'm going to have to move it over there. I'm going to have to rotate it. Right. Line it up. All right. That's looking pretty good. Let me scooch it a little bit to have it line up. All right. Unicorn meat. Yeah. Incidentally, Marcus made this. And so if you want to psychologically evaluate somebody over the choices of this artwork, you can talk to Mr. Kennedy. All right, but here, let's talk. Oh, and Sarah, apparently they work together on it. Sick monkeys. All right. So this is looking pretty good. This is not too bad, but something I want to draw your attention to, very important. What is that? What am I looking at? What is that indicative of? And is it good or bad? That is a seam. That is a texture seam. I can see it, right? That looks not good, right? So we talked about what we can do to fix texture seams, right? What did we do last time? With the monkey picture frame, what did we do? Go ahead. We moved the UVs a little bit, right? We moved them, we stretched them out. So here's where my problem is. I can see that this purple here is not lining up with that purple there. So I'm just going to go to UV mode and select so I can figure out where that is. Okay, that's right here. All right, and the other one is probably the other side. Awesome. Okay, so let's work on this. I'm going to grab this UV, and with my move tool selected, I'm going to move it. I'm one way, and that didn't make it better. So I'm going to go the other way. Oh, that was better. Now it's lining up a little bit better. Let me grab the next guy. Move it a little bit. Oh, okay. There we go. Grab the next guy. Oh, it seems like everything needs to come out just a smidge, right? So I'm just going to pull it out and make it fit a little bit better. Does that make sense? It's a little bit off, but I can make it better. Look at that. I'm making it all gone. Right? So that looks better on that side. So guess what I'm going to do over here? Same thing. That's right. So what I'm going to do is move this. Oh, it's not that side because I kind of like that thickness there. So I don't want to move this one. What must I use? The other side. That's right. So I'm going to go to the other side and grab that UV. And I'm going to move it this way. Again, I could go the wrong way first and go, okay, that's not it. Go the other way. Oh, there we go. Grab this one. Here we go. Looks like they all got to come out just a little. Does that make sense? Make it look better by tweaking my UV layout, because even after you've laid out the UVs for your geometry, even after you've created that texture, there's still a little bit of wiggle room if you need to play with it. You can try to improve wherever it doesn't look so great. So it's not like it's completely etched in stone and you're totally rooked at that point. You can still make some adjustments. Make sense? Get a hell yeah? Okay, good. So we got the textures on there now. That's looking pretty good. Right? Again, typically we don't make the texture first and then make the shells fit, but time constraints. We got to find a way to make that happen anyway. So again, this is the UV mapping process. You guys, incidentally, for week 4, you're going to be UV mapping the models that you built, right? So make sure you take a good look at how that process is going. Take a look at your skill checks for UV mapping and make sure you're making adjustments for that turn-in, because the UV mapping turn-in, if I remember right, what is that, 13% of your grade? 13, 14% of your grade? You want to do well on that. In fact, when it comes to week 4, that is approximately 30% of your grade. So can you go to sleep week 4? A couple of you know. Yes, you cannot go to sleep week 4. You need to do well week 4. So don't let that one slide, okay? Stay sharp, stay on it. It's not as time intensive, but there's a lot to do for week 4. Please do well on those. Take your time, use the self-grade. Double check your work before you submit. That's going to be big. All right, so we got to do the AO pass. We're going to talk about that process because this is a great way to accentuate detail on your models. And I know some of you are not familiar with the AO pass and what that is and how that works. But this is part of the texturing process, and great UV layout is critical to it. Just like textures look bad if you don't lay out your UVs well, your AO pass will look terrible if you don't lay out your UVs well. So not yet, but I will. Boop. AO pass, or ambient occlusion. It is also referred to as the spec pass or the dirt pass. And basically what it does is, if you look at this model here, you can see there's sort of some shadowing in there. And that shadowing is basically permanent. You create like permanent shadows. They call it the dirt pass because it has a tendency to make your model look a little bit dirty, a little bit weathered, which is cool in terms of the texturing process. But what I really like about the AO pass is it really accentuates detail because it throws sort of a darker color into the crevices, which makes the stuff that sticks out pop out even more. It really accentuates the details that you build into your models. And if you're going to model and you don't want to really do the textures, but you want to show off your models and make them look good, at least put an AO pass on it because it makes them look beautiful when you put it on there, much more so than without. So in terms of that AO pass, again, it is a texture. And the way it works, it's kind of a weird thought process, but much like photographic paper captures light and shadow information and gives you an image, what happens is we create a special material in Maya. And this material basically senses light and shadow. That's what it does. That's all it does. So I take this material and I make my objects out of that, not Lambert anymore, this special light sensitive material. And what happens is light shines on the objects, and then Maya and the rendering engine that we're going to use to do this, called Arnold, takes a look at your objects and it says, oh, look, there's some shadowing in here because the light is shining on the object and I see that there's shadows in there. And what it does is it literally records the shadows. It burns them into an image using the faces and your good quality UV layout to record where those shadows go. And then it creates what we call a texture, basically an image. And then we can apply that to the geometry. And then your model has like permanent shadows on it, which again makes them look really cool. But let's talk more about AO and what's going on in there. Boom. All right. So first, let's talk about what that is. If you make a fist right now and you look at the top of your fist, you will see the little Charlie Brown tree, right? It's just like the one from the Christmas special. 3 branches, it's just missing the little ball on the top. But if you look at that, those crevices, those details from your fingers and your hand are visible because of self-shadowing. Light literally cannot get in there and it creates a shadow, and that's what accentuates that detail and makes that interesting to look at. Otherwise it would just be flat, right? Almost devoid of detail. So that shadowing accentuates the detail. And even if you like just crinkle your hands a little bit, you can sort of see little creases and crevices in there, and that shadowing is what makes those things highly visible. Light meets dark, we see shape change. So what we're going to do is try to basically capture that self-shadowing idea. That's part of reality, but we want it on our models too, again, to accentuate detail and draw attention to the really cool stuff that we built on there. And we use this AO pass to do that. And again, it's called a dirt pass or a spec pass. And it basically creates permanent shadows on your model to help accentuate the details. Now, the process, and actually what's really great about it, is it's not even a complicated process. Like if it was hard, I'd be like, oh no, it's really so super easy. But of course it is contingent on you having a good UV layout. Poor UV layout yields poor AO pass. But just to give you an idea of AO pass and what it's doing, let's take a look at a sample AO pass. Documents, skill check, source images. Here we go. All right. Here is a sample AO pass of MyJar. Okay. And like I said, this AO pass is a means of recording shadow information and creating an image of it. So it's like a permanent record of what faces had shadow on them and which did not. Now, just looking at this image, what do you think this is? What do you guys think? It's my jar, right? So this must be close. It's the bottom of my jar, right? But bottom of my jar on the outside, because it doesn't get shadow. What's this then? The bottom of my jar on the inside, because light doesn't make it all the way down to the inside of my jar, so it's dark. Does that make sense? So that's the shadow inside my jar. That's the light outside. Let's look at this piece. It's darker at the top, very dark, and it slowly gets lighter. What part of my jar is that, do you think? It's the inside of my jar, because it's darkest at the bottom, and it gets lighter as it goes towards the lip where the light can actually get in. Does that make sense? What do you think this is? That's that rim, right? It's got that shadow on there. Does that make sense? It's recording all that information so that I can apply it back to my model. Make sense? All right. So again, this is a super easy process and a great result. So let's do it in 4 minutes. You ready? We can do this. All right. So step one. Step one for creating the AO pass, we have to activate the Arnold rendering engine. Now, the rendering engine is basically it's a third-party plugin, which means a different company made it, but they made it so it would work with Maya. And what it does is basically when you look at a final image, a render, that image is a drawing that your computer drew, taking into account the materials, the lights, the reflectivity, the geometry, everything that's going on. It ultimately draws a picture for you of what you see. So this rendering engine is called Arnold. And again, it was built to work with Maya, but it wasn't built by Autodesk. And we have to turn it on because it's not on by default. So first, these are the steps for turning on Arnold. Step one. You go to, oh, let me open my jar. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to set my project to my skill check because that's where my jar is. And I'm going to open my UV jar. All right, so there it is. And again, here's my jar in the editor so you can see my layout. All right, so in terms of activating Arnold, we go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager. This is the path to switch on Arnold. All right. Once the Plugin Manager window opens, we're going to scroll down, Gesundheit, and you will come to an item called MTOA Bundle. That is the Maya to Arnold bundle. If you downloaded Maya using the link we gave you, it's there. So you just got to scroll down to it. And you check on loaded. Once you've checked it on, you hit refresh. And in old copies of Maya, when I redid that, it crashed Maya immediately, so I'm not going to do it. But loaded, refresh, and then you will notice that all of a sudden, Arnold is a menu item on your main menus in your modeling shelf, right? And that wasn't there before. Does that make sense? Now Arnold is turned on and ready to go. Now, the reason we turned it on is because we need this special material, this material that captures shadow information. So, since it's a material, we have to apply this new material to our jar. So what window do you think I have to go to? Hypershade, that's right. I could hear the groaning. So if you notice in the Hypershade, what's different now is there's an Arnold section, and that wasn't in there before. And if you click on shader, right up at the top, you'll see the ambient occlusion, AI, ambient occlusion shader. So all you have to do is click on that to create it. And it makes this material. And it looks kind of like a black background with a spotlight in the middle. Okie dokie. So now we have to apply this material to our object. How do we do that? Middle mouse button, drag and drop. Now my jar is made of this new special capture the shadows information material. So now that it's been applied, now all we have to do is make Arnold do its job. So step one for creating the AO pass, select the geometry in object mode. Now, very important, please don't forget this. This jar is made of one material. Therefore, it is one object, one piece of geometry. Therefore, we select it and do the process. If we were modeling or if we were creating an AO pass for an object that was made of many pieces, we would select all the pieces and combine them. Select the pieces of geometry, mesh, combine, and make sure we combine them. The reason being, it's going to create a texture image for each piece of the object. If we leave it as a bunch of pieces, it's going to make an image for each piece. So that gets obnoxious in terms of reassigning. So if it's a multiple pieced object, select all the pieces, mesh, combine, then do these steps. Does that make sense? Important difference. This is one piece of geometry. We don't have to worry about it. Select the geometry in object mode. All right. Under Arnold, you go to Utilities, Render Selection to Texture. And that's why we have to select it. Utilities, Render Selection to Texture. When that window opens up, right up at the top, it says Output Folder, and that's basically where do you want this image to go when you make it. Output, the picture it's going to make. So if you click on this little part here that says ... you can tell it, I want it to go to my source images folder. You can literally select that because that's, by default, it's going to show up in your images folder wherever you set your project. So, but I'd like it to go to source images because that's where I'm going to put it when I want to apply it to my geometry anyway. So I just choose that, hit select. So it will read that path, okay? You don't have to worry about any of these other settings. You can leave them just like they are. They're fabulous. And you just hit render. And then Maya's going to do its thing. And again, if you go to the source images folder, you'll see that it's created this image, right? For your jar, again, based on your UV layout. If your jar looks weird in terms of the shading, shadow information, you know there's something up with your UVs. Does that make sense? That's a perfect indication of why we do a good job with UVs, because the AO pass will look terrible if your layout is terrible. If you've got shells on top of each other, or they're twisted or there's distortion, that's going to show. Does that make sense? Okay, now once we've got this image, we then just apply it, just like we did any other texture, just like we did with the checker. We make a new Lambert. We apply the textured image to the color channel using the file node, just like we did. Does that make sense? And then you press 6 and you'll be able to see it. We'll see how much of it I can do in -3 minutes. So I know I got to talk faster. So again, I'm going to go back to my regular Maya surface shaders. I'm going to create a new Lambert. With that new Lambert created, I'm going to call it my jar material. In terms of my jar material, I go to the color channel, to the checker box at the end. Again, we've done this several times over the last 2 days. In the Create Render node, we click on File. And then under File Attributes, Image Name, I go to the yellow folder because that tells it where to find this picture. And it goes to my Source Images folder because I've set my project, and I can choose my jar shape EXR. Whatever the object is, it's going to call jar. It's going to put the word shape on the end of it, and then it's an EXR file. So I open that, and it's in the material. And then all I have to do is take this new jar material and apply it to my jar. Now, if your jar receives the material and it looks like kind of transparenty, like there's some glass or something weird, you can see through part of it. Anybody get that? No? Okay, well, it happens. Did you? Okay, it happens quite often. I'm surprised mine didn't do it again. But if you select the material and you open up the attribute editor, what you'll see is, you see right here on my color channel, this little icon that looks like a black box with a little black arrow. That means there's an incoming connection. Something is connected to that. And that's my texture. If your jar is looking transparency a little bit, you've got one of those right here as well over the transparency. And that's why it's looking a little transparent. Very easy to fix. All you have to do is hover your cursor over the word transparency. I'm going to have to do it over color because I don't have a connection. Hold down the right mouse button and you'll find break connection. You break that connection, the transparency thing goes away, and then your jar will look like mine. Does that make sense? You just have to break that connection because it's looking for a transparency component, and that's why it's doing that. Now, one final thing. What's this right here? Seam, right? What did we do last time we had a seam to fix it? We moved the UVs, right? Same thing here. So I select my jar, I open my UV editor, and if I take a close look, let me select my UV, there we go. If I take a close look, you'll see when I get way in here, do you see how my shell is kind of in this darker area? That's, I'm picking that up. That darker stuff is making its way onto my object, and that's why I can see the seam. So what I'm going to do really quickly is I'm going to grab these UVs. You guys, please take more time and be more careful. And using my move tool, I'm just going to move them in a little bit so that my shell is completely in the white area. And I'm going to do it on the other side as well, because if one side is over, the other side is over also. So I'm just going to grab those outermost UVs and scooch them in a little bit. And then the seam is gone because I've made them be over the texture, not somewhat into that sort of darkening area on the edge. Does that make sense? So anywhere there's a seam, you can fix that. Does that make sense? Hell yeah? Okay, cool. Now, the good news is, if you're panicky about this AOPass thing and you're scared of it, I have a little video for you to watch. You know I like to make you guys little videos, so watch it if you need to see it again and again. Rewind, play, jot down the stuff that's the technical things so you don't get them confused. And you can make an AOPass because that's what your skill check is. Because I knew you were like, what's my skill check? I'm so excited. For your skill check, we have this really cool pepper mill, and it's on the activity. You can get it. I think it's also in the download section. We're going to create an AO pass for that. Now, good news is we already UV'd it for you. You don't have to map it. And I know you guys are like, yes, we mapped it already. Okay. All you have to do is the little bit that I showed you. Create the AO pass, make the material, activate Arnold, obviously, make the material, apply it, generate the AO pass, create a new material, plug it into the color channel, and eliminate the transparency if it's there. But is this pepper mill made of one piece or many? Is this pepper mill made of one piece of geometry or many pieces? So then what do I have to do? Got to combine them first, or you're going to get a bunch of maps. Does that make sense? So don't forget, that's your skill check. Make sure you get that done. Any questions? Yeah. The video that I made is how to make the AO pass, just like I just did with the jar. So if you want to see it again, you can watch it. But for the skill check, you're going to create an AO pass for the pepper mill. It's on FSO. Oh, is it within that activity? I think it is. I think it is. But it's definitely where you can get it. I would never put it where it's hard to find. All right. So thank you very much, everybody. Good job. Sorry we went over a tiny bit, but the first class went over a tiny bit. What am I going to do? In fact, I think by the same amount. Weren't they over by 10? All righty. So see you guys on Thursday. We'll do some more.